Ethanol as a fuel is a very complex issue, but it's perhaps the most important one for you to understand the details of, because simply knowing them will force changes in directions that will have so much positive benefit for so many areas of American life that it simply can't be ignored any longer. So the question then becomes how to explain it so it can be easily understood to be as important of an issue as it actually is. Let's try some questions and answers. Ethanol. What is ethanol?
It's corn whiskey, moonshine actually, that's been distilled a couple extra times to get all the water out so it can be mixed with gasoline.
Why do we mix it with gasoline?
This is where it starts to get a little complicated. Ethanol with all the water removed is called anhydrous ethanol. Moonshine with the water left in it is called hydrous ethanol. And anhydrous ethanol added to gasoline is called an oxygenate. This is where the politics comes in and the quality of our fuel goes out the window. Ethanol is not added to gasoline as a fuel. It all has to do with air quality. In 2005, California took the EPA to court and proved that it actually worsens air quality. So Bush came back and said it was no longer about air quality, that it was from that point on going to be used as a fuel to lessen our dependence on foreign oil. The problem is that anhydrous ethanol is not designed to be added to gasoline as a fuel. Anhydrous, or dry ethanol, causes high emissions of aldehydes. Aldehydes are what cause hangovers when we drink too much. The reason it's used is because when aldehydes and smog from coal burning and diesel engines mix in the sun, the smog is dissolved. What California did was show that the end result of this was worse for the environment and human health, even though the smog can no longer be seen anymore.
So why do we keep using it?
Strictly for political reasons. It makes no sense whatsoever to be adding it to gasoline.
What about the fact that it cuts down on emissions of the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide CO2?
That's another complicated question. Everything related to anhydrous ethanol is overly complex. If you take what the EPA claims at face value, which is that anhydrous ethanol causes a 2 to 3% loss of mileage when added to gasoline at a 10% ratio, it's still highly debatable that it lessens CO2 emissions over gasoline without it added to it at all. Many studies show it increases CO2. Others done by the industry still don't really make a case that it doesn't. But the ethanol industry passes out a lot of money around Washington, D.C., while a lot of farmers make money selling corn to produce it from. So the government says that it's lessens CO2 emissions. At least that is what they say most of the time. But they're always going back and forth on that one. For the sake of argument, let's say that it's as they say as far as CO2 emissions are concerned, and rather look at the actual loss of mileage. It causes a much greater loss than 2 or 3%. In some engines it causes more than the amount of ethanol added to the gasoline. What I mean is that if you add 10% ethanol and lose 10% mileage or more, then it's better not to add it at all. The truth is that if it could be pumped out of the ground ready to be added to gasoline free of charge, it still wouldn't make sense as a gasoline additive the way they use it now, because it causes a greater loss of mileage to the overall national fuel supply than if it wasn't added to gasoline in the first place. Since it doesn't come out of the ground ready to be added to gasoline, but is very expensive and intensively burdensome on the economy to produce, well, like I said, the only reason we use it is for political reasons. But there's an even deeper side to answering that question, which is the debate about whether CO2 causes climate change in the first place. There's a side of the climate change debate that most people don't know anything about, which is how non-CO2 gases cause regional changes in climate on a short-term basis. These are called short-lived gases. CO2 is a long-lived gas. The global warming theory is that CO2 we emit today will eventually work its way up to contributing to a global warming by raising the overall levels of atmospheric CO2. But it can take a few years from when it's emitted to play a role in that theory, while CO2 has an atmospheric shelf life on average of around 100 years. Short-lived gases cause weather changes where they are emitted or drift to, which begins to happen as soon as they enter the atmosphere by the way they react with other pollutants, the sun, and atmospheric water vapor. This is what the changes in climate we see going on today are attributed to, but it isn't talked about because the political support for the CO2 theory is so strong. This is because of plans to tax everything that causes CO2 emissions, which is pretty much everything human beings do, something that liberal Democrats and Europeans have been trying to get done for over 20 years while spending billions upon billions of dollars in order to try and achieve it. These CO2 taxes are supposed to one day create a whole new side of the world's economy that bureaucrats can then use as they wish, because CO2 is not the problem they've made it out to be. Short-lived gases are. Short-lived gases are easily dealt with, while they are the worst for human health and the environment. So moving in that direction would stop the changes in climate we're being told is global warming, while we would save trillions of dollars in medical expenses caused by short-term gases making us sick. But if they deal with short-term gases now, changes in weather will stop, so average Americans would be much less inclined to believe that the CO2 global warming theory is real. Last year there was a meeting in Copenhagen that was supposed to lead to a worldwide tax on CO2, but just prior to the meeting, files were leaked from a research center in England that showed that the CO2 theory is largely bogus. So that tax plan has gone out the window. But those at the center of it can't admit to themselves that the game is over and start moving on to dealing with short-term gases. If things had gone the way they wished in Copenhagen, then as CO2 mitigation plans started to be put in place, they would have started to deal with short-term gases from air pollution perspective to make it look like CO2 programs were working.
I have to tell you honestly that my first impression of what you're saying is not to believe it. How do you know all of this?
Climate science is very difficult to understand, while the papers written about it are made overly confusing for anyone other than climatologists to understand. So most politicians don't really understand it and make decisions based on who lines their pockets with the most cash. I'm not saying there's a conspiracy to lie to the world about this, but really I hope there is, because if there isn't, then it means an awful lot of people know about it and are going along with it anyway. I know these things from books I've read, not Al Gore's books, but books and papers written by scientists for other scientists that are very hard to understand. At least that is the way they appear when first looking them over. But if you read them all the way through, there are actually paragraphs throughout them that explain what they're talking about in a way that can be understood after a few searches on the meaning of some of the words or to find what pollutants are being referred to by their elemental initials. It's really not hard to become very familiar with what's really going on if you know that most climate science papers are not as threatening to read as they first appear. But you don't have to trust me or go to all that trouble. All you have to do is find the few news articles that have been written about it when there are pushes to try to change the way climate science is perceived by the average American. Like when Copenhagen talks were first falling apart, a paper that was produced for easy public consumption, that a lot of articles were written about explaining how short-term gases causes changes in climate, some being warming while others are cooling, which of course explains the confusion where one day CO2 alarmists are saying a warm week in the middle of the winter shows global warming is real, while the following weeks are frigid with record amounts of snow. This is why over the last few years the term global warming is slowly being replaced with climate change, because global warming refers to one aspect of climate change, one that has yet to be proven. Regional climate change, not of a global nature, but happening globally because of how much short-term gases human beings emit in different places around the world, however, has been proven for decades.
Wait a minute. Slow down here. Are you saying that the record warm spells as well as the record cold and snow storms are man-made, caused by what you call short-lived gases? That's a little bit much to believe. How can you possibly back a claim like that up?
I can back it up with my own research. I've done research that shows how weather patterns around here where we live just outside Washington, D.C. follow weekly cycles, meaning for many consecutive weeks the weather will be the same on the same days of the week as the last week, with temperatures rising and following changes in pollution levels between work week rush hour traffic and lesser polluting weekend driving. My findings are quite provoking, revealing among other things that the changes in climate we're witnessing now cannot possibly be caused by CO2, because CO2 takes years to work its way into the upper atmosphere, where it's then said to cause the global warming effect. So there is no way it can cause weekly weather patterns. I've also taken maps that show nationwide daily rain patterns and jet stream movements over the U.S. and built them into movies where the maps are separated into weekly segments that show that there are also weekly weather patterns that the jet stream and national storm systems follow. But you don't have to take my word for it. There's highly respected research that shows these same facts to be true, like the paper I was telling you about that came out as the Copenhagen summit was just coming unglued. It says we can stop weather pattern changes happening now and not worry about CO2 for 40 years if we focus on eliminating certain pollutants that are also bad for human health. This suggestion is not at all a new one, which is the idea that we can pay for upgrading industries that pollute with the money saved from less Americans getting sick from being exposed to that pollution, the main ones of which are called non-methane VOCs, like formaldehyde and acetaldehyde, or aldehydes, the same one emitted by adding anhydrous ethanol to gasoline.